Well, good morning and happy Sukkot, or happy Feast of Tabernacles. And I'll bring you the traditional Hebrew greeting, which is Hag Sameach, which simply means happy holidays. And today is October 3rd. We're starting a new month, and this is the last official feast in the seven feasts of the Lord. And if you've been following me for any amount of time, you know that I've been talking about the Feast of the Lord for a long time now. In fact, when I think about it, I started doing this back in 2002. So here we are coming up on 18 years now of doing this, pretty much full-time, traveling all around the world giving this message. And I was trying to do the math because I didn't want to overstate how many times I've done the presentation on the Feast of Tabernacles. But back in the heyday when I was really out there, preaching and teaching on the road, I was easily doing this 30 to 40 times a year. So over 18 years, it's got to be anywhere from, conservatively, 650 to 700 times I've done this presentation. And people used to ask me all the time, Joe, don't you kind of get tired of saying the same thing over and over again? Well, the truth is, if I did this to the same crowd, the exact same crowd every week, then sure, it'd kind of get old after a while. But I had the privilege of being in front of a different church, a different congregation, a conference floor, pretty much every weekend or every other weekend for well over a decade and a half. And so each church, or every time I presented it, the crowd that was there brought out something different from me to present to the message. So it's been a lot of fun, to be honest with you, sharing with people about the Feast of the Lord. And you have to remember that when I first started doing this, today it's so accepted. A lot of people have used my teaching as a basis, which is kind of cool. And now Hebraic roots is all over the country, and it's really, really amazing, actually. But when I started doing this, nobody was doing it. I had just come back from Israel, and God gave me the revelation of the feast and the Hebraic culture. But when I was doing it back then, it was tough schlepping for a while. People weren't really into it. They were kind of like, Joe, like, it's kind of cool, but we're not Jewish, and why are we hearing about all this Jewish stuff? And once people began to understand my heart, and they knew, hey, I'm not coming in here to try to convert anybody. I'm not in here telling anybody, you've got to start doing this or you got to stop doing that. I'm just a Christian coming to my Christian brothers and sisters. And when they caught my heart, God really opened up the door to be able to take this to churches all around the world. And I have to tell you, out of all the time I've been doing this, the last 2 years have been the most fun, because I've been teaching this in Africa. And it started with South Africa, and now, of course, that God's got my heart in West Africa, in Liberia. And I absolutely love teaching on the Jewish or the Hebraic roots of our faith over there. Here we have so much access to videos and YouTube and Facebook and all kinds of different media. And in certain parts of Liberia where I've gone, they don't have internet access. So to be able just to quickly look something up and get the info behind it or watch a video, they just haven't had that capability and that privilege, really. So being able to be there in person and traveling from village to city to countryside, and they don't even know what the Hebraic roots of the Christian faith is. We had to start saying that we're going to take you backstage to help you see what was going on, behind the ministry and the miracles of Jesus. And man, it has been so, not just fun, it's been so rewarding. Because these are not just the people in the churches, but the pastors are so overwhelmed and they're so thankful, because they've said to me, Pastor Joe, now we understand, now we get what Jesus meant, and we know why the Bible says that. And, my favorite part of preaching in Africa is that when they get excited, they stand up. They don't just start waving, their hankies and stuff, but they start running around the building. They start throwing things at the platform. Nothing that could hurt you, just like soft stuff. But it's just so much fun, and it does my heart so much good to know that there's a group of people who are really wanting to get this and are so thankful to be able to get it. So it's been an absolute privilege, and I don't know how many more doors God's going to open up in Africa, but I'm telling you, I'm ready to go, because I just love the reaction, knowing that I'm helping them, taking them to a deeper place of understanding of Jesus and with the Bible as a whole. So thank you so much for joining me this morning on this first full day of Tabernacles. It started last night at sunset, but this morning is the first full day. And so we're going to look at a story in the book of John, chapters 7 and 8, that when you first read it, you might think, well, Joe, what connection does this have to the Feast of Tabernacles? And it's in the text. It tells you exactly what day and holiday it is or holy day it is. But if you don't understand the cycles of the feast, you're not going to get the connection. So today we're going to take our time and go through a story that takes place in the temple area in the Gospel of John. And once you get the background, I believe you're not going to have just a wow moment, because of the information, but oh wow, God really has provided this for me, for us. It's one of those really, really cool things. And, people always ask me, Joe, how do I get this information? So let me just get it out of the way. I'm not in churches anymore because of COVID-19. In one way, this is kind of even better because I can record a message whenever I want. I don't have to wait for an invitation or wait to fly to a church. I just kind of come down to my little makeshift studio here and I can talk straight to the camera, and there's tens of thousands of people on the other side. So because of COVID-19, I'm actually preaching to the biggest crowd I've ever preached in my life. So it's really cool. But when I was in person, I would be able to tell people, oh, just go to the back table. You can pick up this book or this video or whatever. Well, we can't do that today. But if you do enjoy this kind of behind the scenes, the backstage Hebraic roots teaching, then there's two products I'll point your attention to. Number one is go to my website, joeamaral.org, and go to the shop section there. And there's a book there called Understanding Jesus, where everything you hear today, all the Hebraic backgrounds and the talking of the feast, that's all in the book, as well as a lot more. And if you're not a reader, then you can grab the DVD that I created quite a few years ago now, but the information is still as relevant as ever. And it's called God's Holy Days, and you can get it as a digital download for $9.99 on the website. You can download it and stream it and start watching it right away, or you can also get the physical DVD if you'd rather do that. So let me take us to our text for today, and it's not going to be a long message, but I'm hoping it'll be an impactful message. And the whole time that I'm speaking, I'm praying in the background that it's going to move right from just all this really kind of cool information, but it'll move down into our hearts. I say this all the time because it's got to go from information to transformation. And when we get the revelation, that's a lot of shuns, but when we get the revelation of the information, it provides a transformation in our hearts. And it might sound all kind of cool or whatever, but it's not just about learning stuff for the sake of learning stuff. It's about learning stuff so that it'll begin to make a change in you, who you are, how you understand the Bible, and then more importantly, how you live out the Bible. So let's go to our text today. We're going to find it in John chapter 8. And it's a story that we all know really well, we're pretty familiar with. So let me just kind of read the whole thing, and I might interject a little bit, but let's read the text, and then we'll go back to understand what's the connection of what happens here to what's going on today, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot in Hebrew. So John chapter 8, verses 3 and 9. It says, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down. Now this is where we need to start paying attention to what he's doing. Because in Rabbinic Judaism, it's not always so much about the rabbi is saying, it's what he's not saying because of what he's doing. And a lot of times, people will say, I've heard the argument, I never really heard Jesus say, yes, I'm the Messiah, come to me. Well, because that's not proper Rabbinic Judaism. You wouldn't simply come out and make a statement. You would make statements that would draw people to a specific Bible verse that you wanted to draw them to. You would do an action that they would interpret as Messianic in nature because of what the prophecies were in the Old Testament. And this is a classic example of Jesus operating in rabbinic mode. He's not a Pentecostal preacher. He's not showing you PowerPoints. He's not walking you to the discovery. What he's doing is he's hinting. And this is a rabbinic tradition. It's something called remez. And remez is a teaching style, and it means to hint. Simply point your students in the right direction and then let them make the discovery for themselves. And this is what Jesus starts to do. So let's pick up on it. So they're trying to ask him, well, what do you think we should do? We know what the law says, but what do you say? And he says, the text says, but Jesus bent down and he started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Now you notice that John is very careful to tell us that again he stoops and he begins to write in the ground. Why does John bother to give us this detail that if he would have said, so during his presentation or during his rebuttal, Jesus wrote in the ground, and maybe not be bothered to tell us it was once, twice. He wrote in the ground. How many times he did it is important. Well, obviously it is important because John records it. And as we come to understand how this connects to Tabernacles, now we know why he mentioned a second time. And why it was at the second time, let's continue here, at this, okay, at what? At him writing in the ground a second time. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with a woman still standing there. Now, for those of us who live in the West or anywhere outside of the physical land of Israel, we've not been taught to pay attention to these, what seem to be, minor details. So what? He wrote once, twice, three times. The point is he wrote. We need to understand that Matthew, Mark, and John specifically are Jewish males writing to a Jewish audience, to their contemporaries. I've often said that the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. That's not just a cool play on words. There's a world of difference in that statement. Yes, it's for us today. No matter where we live in the year 2020, we can take these things that were written so long ago. We can read about these actions that were taken so long ago, and we can learn from them, and we can apply them to our lives. Yeah, absolutely amazing. It's for us. But it wasn't written to us in the sense that we weren't the ones they had in mind when they wrote. They weren't writing it to this, Portuguese Canadian guy named Joe living in Milton. They weren't writing it to me. They were writing it to the guy who lived in the same village as them, the guy who lived in Jerusalem, the guy who was maybe from Nazareth or from the Galilee or from wherever. They wrote it in such a way that when they read this, they went, oh, I see why John is recording that a second time, because we know that rabbis would, and see, they would understand. But here we are as Christians who love God and who love his word, and we want to have a better understanding of it. But because we're so far removed, not just culturally and physically, but through space and time, we don't understand always the nuances of why the Bible records what it does. And so I often do this, when I'm in person at a church service, and I try to make it funny because I want people to really understand it's serious, but it's also comical at the same time. So when they come to Jesus and they say, listen, we've caught this woman and, we are well within our rights to give her the death penalty, but we want to give you a chance to chime in. So basically they're saying to Jesus, if you say to let her go, we'll let her go. But if you say that we should stone her, then we're going to stone her. I mean, that's huge. If somebody came to you today and say, hey, we caught this person committing this crime, and we know what the law says, but we're going to give you the law today. Basically, you get to be the law. And if you say to let them go, fine. And if you say to convict them, we're going to convict them. Could you imagine that somebody's freedom, somebody's life was in your hands, and instead of answering them, what you do is you pick up your phone and you start scrolling through your feed. When Jesus stoops and he begins to write, that's the equivalent of scrolling through his Facebook feed. It doesn't make any sense. Why would he do that? This woman's life is literally hanging in the balance. And not only does he do it once, but they're kind of like, did he hear us? Jesus, we just want to, remind you, we're still waiting for your answer. And he looks at them and he tells them, whoever has no sin to cast the first stone, and still nothing. But when he stoops a second time and he begins to scroll through his feet again, now all of a sudden, we're not told why. And if you don't know the background, it doesn't make any sense. So he writes twice in the ground and they drop their rocks and then they walk away. I mean, what did he do? What did he write? How did he write it? I mean, my goodness, whatever it was, it must have been like, whoa, huge. It was. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a really long time to make my point today. And we're going to walk around this verse. And you might say, Joe, just tell us what it was. No, it's not enough, because you're not going to get the full impact of why it was so powerful. So let's take a little bit of time and walk around this verse and really get a sense for why he was doing what he was doing and why the people had the reaction that they had. So let's try to answer a couple of questions that I think will really help us to understand the fullness and the depth of what is going on in this scenario. First, we're going to try to find out when did this take place. Is there anywhere in the Bible that tells us exactly what day this story took place on? And your instinct is to say, no, it doesn't say, it was Tuesday, November the 4th. It doesn't give us a date. Why? How can we know? Well, it actually does, because this story is in John chapter 8. So we're going to get to the when, and then we're going to talk about where did it take place. And you might say, Joe, it's Jerusalem. I mean, isn't that enough to say? No, not just Jerusalem, not just the temple, but where in the temple? Because you have to understand that this culture, its whole life circled around the temple and the practices of the temple and the practices of the priests in that temple. So when he was and where he was were actually very, very important. And we're going to bring that to light, and then we're going to come full circle, and bam, we're going to land this plane at the end. And you're going to go, whoa, no wonder they dropped their rocks and they ran. And that's kind of the revelation that I'm hoping that you're going to have today. So John chapter 8 is where the story takes place. But if you back up just a little bit to the book of John chapter 7, he kind of talks about Jesus coming into the city and what was going on and what was happening. So in John 7:37, he says, on the last and greatest day of the festival, or the last and great day of the feast. Okay, right away we read that. We're like, well, what does that mean for us? How many feasts are there? What feast has a last and great day? Well, guess what it is? The Feast of Tabernacles, the feast that we find ourselves right in, Sukkot. So 2,000 plus years ago, exactly today, Jesus came to the temple, and he says, he stood in a loud voice and he says, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Now, we love that verse. We love to talk about, oh, whoever's thirsty, come and drink of me. He'll satisfy you. And that's all really beautiful. But man, guys, you've got to understand the power of the statement of presenting himself as a water that will quench your thirst for always in the middle of the Middle East, in a place that's dry, that's got desert, and that has very little rain. So to understand the power of his statement, even though geographically where he is, that region, I mean, if he said, who wants to drink some water and you'll drink it one time and you'll never be thirsty again? Oh, sign me up. I want that. I mean, that's what the people would have said. So we're going to come back to the living water in just a moment. So knowing about the 7 feasts of the Lord, and I'm not going to go all into that today because I've done that so often in the past. You can check it out in the video. You can check it out in the book, or go back to some of my previous posts here on Facebook and even on YouTube. And I talk about all 7 feasts and the cycle and where they are in the book of Leviticus, and that's all there. But to save us some time, go and look at that. But understand that when John says that Jesus came to Jerusalem on the last and great day of the feast, we know 100% biblically that he's talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. And so it's not just important to know that it was the Feast of Tabernacles, but it's important to know what was going on in the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles. When we understand the practices the high priest was carrying out, and the Messianic expectations was at its highest point during this Feast of Tabernacles. When we understand all of that and we put it all together, and then Jesus comes in on this specific day, not the first day, on the last and the great day, when I walk you through what was going on that last day, you're going to have a whoa kind of a moment. So once we have the when it took place, that's the first half of the puzzle. And we're going to come back to that, because remember, we know when now. We know it was a lasting great day. But I'm going to walk you through some of the practices and some of the traditions that took place on that day. So we got the when. Well, the what is coming in just a moment. Let's get to the where. Even where this story takes place is very, very important. It's very telling. Jesus is self-aware. He's very aware of who he is. He's very aware of his circumstances. He knows what's going on politically. He knows what's going on religiously. You'll notice sometimes in the Bible that he'll be in one place and he'll say, don't tell anybody what I've done for you. And that's usually in the north and around the Galilee area, because that was the home for the Zealots, they were this religious group of Jews who were sick and tired of living under the oppression of the Romans, and they wanted a king to come, or a challenger at least, to come and drive the Romans away. And if Jesus did things that were too messianic in the Galilee, they would say, he's the Messiah, let's crown him as king, and let's go to Jerusalem and kick some Roman butt. And so in the north, he's like, don't tell anybody what I've done for you. Like, this is between us. But then he comes to Jerusalem and he starts saying things like, go show yourself to the priests. Well, hang on a second. Like, it's, is it schizophrenia? He's one person in one part of the country and he's a different person somewhere else? No, it's because he's aware. He knows that the Zealots are in the north, so don't say anything that would incite a rebellion. That's not what he's come to do, not at his first coming. In Jerusalem, he knows that the religious are there in the temple, searching and seeking out and asking God for the Messiah to come. And so as his mission is coming to an end, he's beginning to get braver and bolder with his claims. And so he understands where he is and what he's doing. So let me show you this picture of a model of what the temple looked like, the Temple Mount in the first century, in the time of Jesus, also known as the Second Temple period. And if you look at this picture, you'll see it's got this massive, platform, which is the place where everybody stands. And then you have the walls around the temple. And just below this, you have Mount Moriah. You can't see it anymore because the temple was just kind of positioned on it and very few people could come around. And when Herod comes, he has a massive expansion project. And so basically he wants to use Mount Moriah, but he also wants to fill it in around to make a bigger platform. So basically, think of a shoebox and then take it upside down and he puts it over Mount Moriah. And so now he's got retaining walls all around and he's got a huge, massive platform where scholars tell us that around 10,000 people are able to go and worship at a time. So it's a huge upgrade for the temple. And then as we kind of zoom in a little bit, you'll notice on the left and right side of the eastern gate, as you come into the temple complex, you'll notice a little partial wall there. And that partial wall was about 3 feet high, and that was a barrier. So in the outer court, as it's known, that massive platform I told you about, anybody was allowed to come. Man, woman, Jew, Gentile, anybody was allowed to come there. That was fine. But where those two strips are, where those walls are, they found remnants of a sign that was affixed to that little gate. It was basically something like this, that no male Jews allowed past this point under penalty of death. Okay, so in the outer court, everybody's allowed to come in. And then you get into the inner court where only men are allowed. And then you go in through those golden doors into the next area where you can see those steps there. So the outer court, the inner court, and then you have kind of not the holy place, but an area where only the priests were allowed to be. And then you go even closer and into the Holy of Holies. And we know, we just came through it through the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. That's where the priest was allowed to go, only one person, one time, one day on the calendar. And so think about it. So out here, so God's presence is in the Holy of Holies, right? It's between the two wings of the cherubim. And so you can see the closer you get to God's presence, the more restrictive the access became. It was everybody, men, priests, high priest. And so begin to think about where this woman would have been, the woman who's caught in the act of adultery. Can she be in the Holy of Holies with the high priest? Of course not. Absolutely impossible. Can she be in that holy area where the priests are allowed to be? No, she can't be there either. Can she be even within the confines of that fence, of that gated area? No, because only men are allowed there. Where can she be? Only in the outer court. Now that's going to come back into play in just a few moments. And so we know that Jesus, when he comes to the temple, he meets this woman. Clearly they're in the outer court. But how did Jesus get to the outer court? How do we know that he's there? Well, when we study historical documents, we learn about the different practices. Edersheim is a very well-known author who meticulously writes about the roles of the priests during the times of the temple. And he preserves for us some really, really cool information that's not written in the Bible. And some people might be saying right now, well, if it's not in the Bible, then it's not important. No, it's not in the Bible because it didn't need to be in the Bible. Because as soon as John said that he came on the last and great day and stood up and said, drink of me and you'll never thirst again, every Jewish person in the kingdom who would have read that in that time would have known exactly when and where Jesus was when he made that statement and why it was so powerful. Because there was something called a water libation ceremony. And I know that's terminology we're not used to. And again, it's not written in the scriptures because it didn't need to be, because everybody at that time would have known already. The moment they read that statement, they would have known, oh, he chose that day to come and make that statement? Whoa, that was very brave. That was a huge thing to do. And so during the days of the Feast of Tabernacles, they would do this every day, and then it would culminate on this last and great day of the feast. And the priest would have a large container that would be empty. He would then take this large container that was empty and he would walk down, and you can see I have a picture here and I kind of have like the path marked out for you. And they would come out the southern part of the temple and they would walk down through this covered channel of water that would lead them to a place called the Pool of Siloam. And you know this name Siloam. It's recorded that Jesus does one of his miracles there. But why is the Pool of Siloam important? Because Siloam, that pool, is filled with a very specific kind of living water. It had to be filled with what was called living water. And living water has a very simple definition to it. It's water that's brought to a source not by the hands of men. So if you take a jar of water from somewhere and poured it into a container, it's water, but it's not living water because it didn't come down naturally. So there's only three sources that we know of that can make something to be deemed living water. Either it's rain, it's rivers, or it's springs. And it hardly rains in Jerusalem, only during a short time during the rainy season from November till about February. That's it for the whole year. That's all they got. Not a lot of rivers, actually no rivers in Jerusalem. You have the Jordan River coming all the way from Mount Hermon in the north, going all the way south till it dumps into the Dead Sea. So there's not a lot of rain. There's no rivers. The only other source is springs. And so springs, people literally went to war over springs because that was a source of living water, not just for the daily practical living, but also for the religious living. You needed this to carry out the ceremonies of the temple and of the priest. And so the priest would come down and he would take this empty container and then he would dip it into the Pool of Siloam, fill it now with what? With living water. And he would walk back up to the temple area. And Edersheim and other scholars tell us that there was a whole procession behind them of priests and Levites, and they were playing the flutes and the drums and all these other instruments, and it was like a worship service on the move, and they were praising God. And they would get all the way back to the temple, and then you kind of had the moment of moments when you got back to the temple, because now imagine how dramatic this must have been. The priest would now take that container. I mean, I have this little tiny container, my little glass filled with water. Now imagine in a dry season, the priest would take that container and he would raise it up, and at some point in the ceremony, he would tip it over and he would begin to allow that living water to splash upon the altar. And there was a negative and a positive reaction. The negative was like, it's the dry season, dude, and you're just throwing water away. It's like just throwing gold into the streets to be trampled upon. But there was a very beautiful meaning to that. And the meaning was, Lord, this image, this presentation that I'm doing right now, where I'm pouring out this living water, Lord, let this be just a cry to you. Send us your living water. Yes, the rain for the coming rainy season, so that all the fields and you know, and the plants and the crops can grow. But it was more than just asking God for physical rain. The living water, this symbol of the rains coming from heaven, was also an idea they had for the Messiah. That when the Messiah came from God, he would be the living water. He would nourish us. He would feed us. He would sustain us. And so as the priest, remember, on the last and the great day of the feast is pouring out the living water. Go back to John chapter 7, verse 37. On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and he said in a loud voice, he said, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. And then it goes on, he talks about that rivers of living water will flow out of your innermost being. And here they are in the dry season, and this guy comes along and he says, hey, who wants water that once you drink it, you'll never be thirsty again? I mean, it must have blown their minds. And not just this spiritual kind of, you know, this symbolism that he was painting for them, but the fact that he said that I am what you're expecting God to provide today. You're asking him to pour out his living water on you. You're asking him to send you his living water. Here it is. I'm the living water. On the very day that the people were expecting the living water to come, the Messiah to come. You see, that's the day that Jesus chooses to come. And if you go back even earlier in John chapter 8, he's way up in Nazareth and he's having a conversation with his brothers, his physical earthly brothers. And they're talking and they said, listen, if you're the Messiah, enough already. Just go present yourself to the people and get it over with. Go to Jerusalem. It's the Feast of Tabernacles. See, they were expecting the Messiah to come at Tabernacles, because Tabernacles is all about God coming to tabernacle, to dwell with us. And again, John talks about that. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He came to tabernacle to be with us. And Jesus says, you go to the feast. I'm not going yet because now is not my time. He says, any day is good for you. You see, Jesus times his visit to Jerusalem. He times it to arrive at the exact moment where the people are expecting the living water to come to the temple. Now, I wish I could tell you that the priests and the people accepted his offer to be their living water. I really wish I could tell you that. People would say, you're the Messiah, wonderful. We will drink of you, of your teaching, and we will now be one in tabernacle with God. But the Bible tells us a different story. It tells us that not only are they upset, not only do they reject him, but they actually cast him out of the inner court area. Now, Jesus is a male. He can be, remember, past that fenced off area in that inner place where the priests are carrying out this water libation ceremony. And the Bible says that the captains of the temple guard, although they were so moved, they had to do what the priest told them to do. And they escort Jesus from that inner area back out to the outer court. And that's where he meets the woman who's caught in the act of adultery. You see how all this kind of comes into play? And just from that one verse, on the last and great day of the feast, if we don't understand what feast day it is and what happened on that last and great day, then all the rest of it just kind of falls a little flat. Now, here's the thing, and I want to end it with this. Even if you don't understand the Hebraic roots, if you've never watched this video and you just, hear a sermon about the woman caught in the act of adultery, and Jesus forgives her, and he says, woman, where are your condemners, or those who condemn you, or your accusers? Go and sin no more, right? It's beautiful that no matter what we've done, we can come to Jesus and he'll forgive us of our sins. He'll love us and embrace us, and he'll send us on our way without judgment. And that's a beautiful message. And if you've preached that before, mazel tov. That's a great message. But I'm telling you, there's so much more to the story when you understand the Hebraic roots surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus, right? Look how much more depth and how much more color is being put on the page now that we understand this background. But we still haven't addressed the question, what did he write in the sand when he stooped down? What was it that he wrote that made those accusers drop their stones and say, we don't know who this guy is, but we know who he thinks he is. We better get out of here. So let's kind of just recap a little bit what we learned. That Jesus came to the temple. He claimed to be the living water, the source of living water. Man rejected him. He's cast out into the outer area, to the outer courts. He meets a woman who's being accused of sin. He forgives her of her sin, and then the stones are dropped. So take all that in the background, and with that, we're going to go to Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 13. And it's one of those verses that if you just kind of read it on its own, you'd be like, okay, maybe I'll figure it out when I get to heaven. I'll ask God when I get to heaven, like, okay, what did that mean? We can know here and we can know now. But all we got to do is just take a little initiative and really dig in. Go backstage. Because all we're doing is, this is from my Liberian friends, backstage. We see Jesus and a woman and some men, and he's writing, and that's all we see. And what we've been doing is we've gone behind the curtain. I have a black curtain in here behind me. And if we go behind the curtain, you can actually see what's back there. And so when you read the story of John chapter 7 and 8, if you're willing to take the time and go behind the curtain and go backstage, oh, the priest was doing the water libation ceremony. Oh, it was the last day of Tabernacles. Oh, he was in the outer court. When all that backstage info becomes part of the story, it makes a lot more sense. So let's keep all of this, and let's close now and go to Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 13, and this is what we get. Lord, you are the hope of Israel, and all who forsake you will be put to shame. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Okay, now remember everything we just said about claiming to be the water. They reject him, and he starts to stoop and write. Keep that all in mind. Those who turn away from you will be what? Written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord. What? The spring or the source of living water. Now, normally when I'm in a church in front of a crowd, this is where I get the big, wow, holy smokes kind of moment, and it is. Even right where you are, go ahead and have a holy smokes moment and just think about it. And if you didn't really get it all, go back, rewind this a few minutes and kind of read that again. God says, one day I'm going to come and present myself as the source of living water. Well, we know that happens during the Feast of Tabernacles. Today, he's saying that at some future Feast of Tabernacles on Sukkot, one day, I'm going to come and present myself as their living water. And they're going to reject me. They're going to reject me. And what am I going to do? To commemorate the fact that they have rejected me, God, the Lord of the living water, I'm going to stoop down in the dust and I'm going to write their names. You see what Jesus was doing back in the book of John? He didn't have to yell at them. He didn't have to start quoting scripture at them. All he had to do was do something rabbinic, which is exactly what the people of the time would have expected him to do. That when he bent down, I believe that Jesus began to write a portion of this, of Jeremiah chapter 17. We know that men by the age of 13 had the Torah memorized. They had the Torah memorized. They had the Old Testament, in fact, memorized. And the students, the yeshiva students, when they would go and study, they would know the Bible inside and out. And you wouldn't have to give them an exact verse. If you just quoted part of a verse, their minds would go immediately to that verse, and they would know the context, the before and the after. You see, when Jesus stoops down on the last and greatest day of the temple, after they've just rejected him as the living water, and he starts to write down Jeremiah chapter 17, their verses would have said this, that we have just rejected. Their minds would have known that they would have just rejected the Lord who claimed to be the source of living water. And now he's writing our names in the dust. And so again, we don't know who this guy is, but we know who he thinks he is. And it's one of those kind of full circle moments. I told you we were going to go all the way around this verse before we got to the end. But I think it was worth the journey, Because once we get the context and we understand all of the background, oh my goodness, it makes so much more sense. So what do we do with this? This is Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot 2020, during COVID-19, during coronavirus. What do we do with all this information? Yeah, it's cool and it's great. Oh, wow. Now I understand that verse, and I'm glad you do. And I'm hoping that this will put something in you that you'll want to go a little bit deeper. And remember, just go over to my website, pop over to the shop section, get a copy of the book or the DVD. All of the feast information and cultural background is in there. Man, I'm telling you, it'll change your life. It'll change the way you see and understand the words and deeds of Jesus in the Bible. But I want you to more than just understand with your head what we're saying today. It's called Sukkot, tabernacle or booths. And this is to commemorate that when the Israelites were freed as slaves from Egypt during the Exodus, that every night they would basically camp out in these little temporary booths. And then they would take them down in the morning, they would move on. They would put them up again, they would move on. And so every year they commemorate this feast. It's to remind them that God had delivered them. But it's more than just your own little personal booth. It's the tabernacle that God commanded Moses to build in the wilderness. And then Solomon made a more permanent structure with the first temple. And then Herod came along in the second temple period and built the second temple. And it was all about going to God. And the only way to get to God was to go to this temple, was to go to this tabernacle. And what John says Jesus was, that he was the one who came to tabernacle with us. We no longer have to go to a building. We no longer have to go to one specific religion or person. It's not about that anymore. Is that when we receive Christ, when he comes into our heart, yes, he comes to tabernacle with us, but then we get to tabernacle with him. You see, the tabernacle isn't a physical place anymore. The tabernacle is about a relationship with the living God. And this Sukkot, this Feast of Tabernacles 2020, if you know him, remain in him. Stay in that booth. Let him be your shelter. Let him be your hiding place. Let him be your protection. But if you haven't known him, or maybe you haven't known him for a long time, I want to invite you to come back to the booth tonight. I want you to come back to the tabernacle and dwell with him and come under that shelter of protection that we only get through a relationship with him. And if you've never made that decision, let me encourage you today. Say yes to the tabernacle. Say yes to the one who is our tabernacle, who is our covering, who is our protection. And when we are in him, no matter what is going on in this world, we are covered under his presence. So I want to invite you this holy day season to come and dwell and be with the Lord in his tabernacle. And I promise you, your life will never be the same again.